Just making sure that all the tech's working. Moni, am I good to go?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us this morning. My name's Kristen Hilton, and I'm Victoria's Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner. I will have met many of you at the roundtables that Ed Santow and I, Human Rights Commissioner for the Commonwealth of Australia, hosted last year, and this is a great opportunity to come back together and reflect on some of the insights and the knowledge that we gain from you, and also to launch really the report which captures a lot of that commentary in freedom of religion in Australia, a focus on serious harms. And I'll introduce Ed, my colleague, in a few minutes, but I also wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Bunurong country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to leaders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the many different countries that you're coming from today. Just also to let you know, we are recording today's discussion and we'll make the video available on both of our organisations' websites after it. So if you've missed it, or if you'd like to watch it again, or if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, then please feel free to do so. And I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that, well, obviously we're coming to you from Zoom, and that many people will have been affected over the last 4 months by COVID-19 in varied ways, their livelihood, their ability to connect with friends and family, and I think particularly from people from faith communities, even the ability to practice their religion. So I'm very conscious of that, and I think we're also having this discussion particularly in Victoria in a very, very interesting period, and I'll come to that in a few moments. But if you're like me, then you would have spent a lot of time over the last few months on Zoom calls, and I think that has given us a glimpse into each other's personal lives in perhaps a way that we might not have seen before. Please excuse any of my 3 children that might enter into the room at any time. And I think those sort of interactions that we're seeing do humanise us and connect us, even in a way in which we feel quite distant from each other. But it also shows us how reliant we are on technology to communicate. And I think those connections, particularly for people of faith, connections to family, culture and community, and those aspects of our private lives that we're seeing more of, are kind of an incidental backdrop to these computerised interactions. It also is a reminder that sharing of your faith, even in this way, but even in normal times, is not always an easy thing to do in the Australian community. And we know, and we certainly heard through our consultations, that people of faith experience violence, abuse, intimidation, discrimination, and vilification on the basis of their religious identity. And if you've had a chance, or when you get a chance to look through the paper, you'll see that these incidences are too common and too explicit and too harmful. And part of the reason that we undertook these consultations was really to focus on those serious harms and think about what we can do, both in our roles, in our organisations, but working together with you as leaders of faith communities to try and get better recognition and the balance of the protection of religious freedoms right. The incidents that the report reflects on are not new. They are patterns of ongoing and persistent hate and fear in our parts of community, and certainly from the Commission's perspective over the last 4 months, we've seen those incidences and the seriousness of them escalate, and I think that happens in a period of fear and uncertainty. So in many ways, the report is coming at a very opportune time. For those of you who are joining from Victoria, we've had now 30 suburbs in lockdown, and many of those suburbs are suburbs that are heavily populated by people from multicultural and multi-faith communities. And already some of the media commentary around the lockdown of those suburbs is beginning to perhaps put an unfortunate spin, I suppose, or unfortunately target members of that community. And many of them have said to us that we didn't get the information that we should have earlier on. And I know that there was definitely, from our point of view, that there was a real delay in properly communicating with people from multicultural and sometimes multi-faith communities about what social restrictions and physical distancing meant. And so we're in this very serious situation here in Victoria, and the last thing that we want to do is see that somehow fertilise experiences of hate and vilification in our community. At the Victorian Human Rights Commission, addressing harm against religious communities and combating hate, including religious vilification, is a central part of our work here, and I know it is for Ed's Commission as well. Our teams across the Commission, they work in various ways with many parts of the community. We provide education and engagement services, and over the next couple of weeks, we're going out to particular communities to inform them about their rights under the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, the Charter, and the Equal Opportunity Act. We have an inquiry and dispute resolution team where we take inquiries from members of the public and also complaints of racial or religious discrimination and vilification. And we have a policy and a legal team that looks at some of these issues from a systemic lens and thinks about what are the structural drivers that we can pull, what are the points of influence, so that we can have a more enduring response to what needs to change. We also developed a multicultural and multi-faith engagement plan a couple of years ago, and at the centre of that plan is better engagement with Victoria's culturally and linguistically diverse communities who we know are often vulnerable to hate. We've seen an 80% increase in reports of hate-based interactions in the last 3 months, and I know the Australian Human Rights Commission has experienced similar increases in their reporting. One of the things, we've also been active over the last couple of months in participating in the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry into Victoria's anti-vilification laws. And part of our submission, I won't go into a lot of detail now, but certainly the centrepiece of that submission is arguing for better protection for Victoria's religious and race-based communities, and also better protection for other people who regularly experience vilification or hate based on their identity. And we will continue to advocate that with your support, and the inquiry's findings will be released in September later this year. So I'm hopeful, if there's one positive thing that comes out of the COVID experience, is that it's really shone a light on how any sort of rupture in our community can very easily give rise to fear and uncertainty, and that has a particular impact on your communities. So Ed and I are really pleased to be here with you today and joining with you today and presenting this report to you, and looking forward to hearing from our panellists and having an opportunity to have a discussion about the report and things that you're experiencing in your community now. So I'll hand over to Ed. Ed will be familiar to many of you. He's been the Human Rights Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission since 2016. And he has a very broad mandate that he's responsible for: technology and human rights, refugees and migration, human rights issues affecting LGBTIQ people, counter-terrorism, national security, and importantly, freedom of expression and freedom of religion. So he's extremely well-versed in the intersection of all of those things, and it's a real privilege to introduce Ed to you today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kristen, and it's been such a pleasure working with the Victorian Commission on this project, and I endorse everything that Kristen's just said. I'm here in Sydney and I'm on Gadigal land, and so I acknowledge the traditional owners of that land and their elders past, present and emerging. When we were thinking about freedom of religion, we tried to go back to first principles. For a person of faith, religion is central to what they think and who they are. In all major religions, like-minded people of faith come together to practice their religion and to live out as a community the principles of their religious belief. So it's a central tenet of liberalism that the freedom to do these things is valued, it's valuable, and it should be protected. It's no surprise, therefore, and absolutely correct, that freedom of religion is also a central core provision of international human rights law as it applies here in Australia. But freedom of religion, like all human rights, needs active and consistent defence. We have seen in recent years in Australia that freedom of religion has become more of an ideological battleground than it has in decades, especially, and let's be open and honest about this, in the context of Australia's marriage equality reform. We at the Australian Human Rights Commission strongly advocated for marriage equality, and we also strongly support the rights of religious communities. We don't think these things need to be in any way mutually exclusive. Amid some of the most bruising of the public debates, I personally was struck by some very insightful commentary. And that basically boiled down to this, that too much we as a country were discussing what might happen in the future in terms of religious freedom without focusing enough on what is happening right now. And in part, this project was designed to be a response to that problem. We were delighted to partner with the Victorian Commission to examine the existing research on serious harms on the basis of religion. And as Kristen mentioned, when we talk about serious harms, we're talking about really serious harm. So we're talking about violence, abuse, intimidation, severe discrimination, and some forms of vilification. And we wanted and were very grateful to hear from those communities themselves. So we came together, we co-hosted with Kristen and her colleagues roundtables in Sydney and Melbourne, and the paper that we launched today summarises what we've learnt so far. It sets out a series of recommendations to government, both state and federal, and I wanted to say as clearly as possible how grateful we are for the input that so many of the attendees on this webinar have given to the Victorian Commission and ourselves. We relied so heavily on that material, and of course it makes perfect sense that it's not just us who is going to be speaking about this today, that we will also be handing over to first Julie as soon as I finish speaking to speak directly from your experience and your community's experience. So we're conscious that many faith communities are regularly consulted about their experience, but sometimes feel that nothing or not enough is done about the problems that they disclose. The reality, of course, is that change, and particularly law reform, can be difficult. What we've tried to set out in this short paper is one way we can keep putting a clear message to government that, one, freedom of religion is deeply important. And two, while many people of faith experience great freedom in Australia, some also experience serious harms on the basis of their religious identity or their religious belief. And as a country committed to human rights, we must never tolerate this. We must push back on that really firmly. We must make people of faith feel safe and valued in their community. So lastly, I'll do the equivalent of what Kristen has just done and talk a little bit about the Australian Human Rights Commission's work on freedom of religion. We consult regularly with religious communities, and we also work with religious communities on areas of common cause. For example, I recently met with a number of religious leaders, some of whom are on this call, to discuss our respective work during the COVID-19 crisis. We also work to protect and promote freedom of religion in other ways. For example, we're currently talking with ACARA, the federal body responsible for the Australian curriculum, about the value of education about religion in the schools and the ways in which that can help bring about better understanding of religion and therefore help promote religious freedom. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce Julie Nathan. Julie has worked as Research Director at the Executive Council of Australian Juries since 2010. She's authored the annual report on anti-Semitism in Australia since 2013. She's the chair of the Anti-Semitism and Racism Committee at the International Council of Jewish Women and co-chair of the Anti-Semitism portfolio at the National Council of Jewish Women in Australia. Her writings on this subject have appeared in many publications as diverse as The Australian to the ABC, and Julie will speak for 5 to 10 minutes on her work documenting anti-Semitism in Australia and what we can learn from this. So thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you, Edward and Kristen. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss anti-Semitism and at the launch of your report into freedom of religion in Australia, focus on harms. As Ed has already said, a little bit about myself and the anti-Semitism report. So the Anti-Semitism report, the ECAJ, Executive Council of Australian Jewry, has produced an annual anti-Semitism report since 1990. And I took that on in 2013. There are 8 types of incidents of anti-Semitism, 8 categories. 4 categories relate to physical attacks against persons or property, and they include physical assault, verbal abuse, harassment, intimidation, vandalism, and graffiti. Then there are 4 other categories which relate to threats of harm. So they're threats by email, postal mail, telephone, and stickers and posters. We do not include as incidents online content or cases of discrimination or incidents of casual anti-Semitism. So I'm sometimes asked why we don't include online hate as incidents. The reason is fairly simple. Firstly, online postings are discourse, so it's what people are saying about Jews rather than what is being done to Jews. Secondly, is almost the sheer amount of online anti-Semitism is like counting raindrops or sand or stars. You know, it's almost limitless. Such is the nature of the internet. For example, so far in this reporting period since October, which begins in October, there are already hundreds of anti-Semitic comments posted on social media sites of some major Jewish organizations. In addition, there are anti-Semitic posts, comments and images on websites and other social media sites. And since October, I've collected well over 2,000 pages of these posts, amounting to several thousand, perhaps up to 8,000 anti-Semitic postings. So by counting and including online hate content as incidents, this would have an intense distorting effect on the number of incidents and thereby would not give a true or accurate picture of what is happening to the targeted population. It would adversely affect the credibility of the data and hence would be counterproductive to countering anti-Semitism. So if we go to the 2019 anti-Semitism report, and this is what it looks like. There were 368 incidents, which was an increase of only 2 incidents over the previous year. However, the previous year, 2018, saw a 59% increase. So this high level remained the same over the 2 years. But during 2019, there was increases in specific areas. So there was a 30% increase in abuse, harassment, and intimidation. Graffiti, there was a 107% increase, and emails were up 61%. The average number of reported anti-Semitic incidents each year from 2013 to 2019 was 272 incidents. So over the last 2 years, the number of reported incidents is well above the average, with 366 and 368 incidents over the last 2 years. Notable incidents over 2019 was the harassment in Melbourne of 2 Jewish school students, a 5-year-old and 12-year-old, which is detailed in the report and also came into the Victorian inquiry. Graffiti in Melbourne, in Paran, over a building complex, massive building complex, lots of graffiti, gas the kikes, reject Jewish poison, Hitler was right, Jews out. And another interesting graffiti attack in Epping in Sydney over the back of many buildings shows the genocidal nature of anti-Semitism. So the graffiti over the walls called for Africans, Asians and Pakistanis to go home or to F off. But when it came to Jews, the graffiti said, kill the Jews. So it kind of shows a difference there within anti-Semitism. So if we're talking about the Jewish community, I'm not sure on the timing here. So in the Jewish community in Australia, there's about 120,000 Jews in Australia. That is 0.4% of the population, so a very small proportion of Australia. Approximately half were born here and half are migrants from Europe, North Africa, Middle East, South Africa, European, Russia and the Americas. The community is highly concentrated geographically with 85% of Jews living in two main areas, the eastern suburbs of Sydney and Caulfield-Sakura areas in Melbourne. The Australian Jewish community has the highest proportion of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. This means that for Australian Jews, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are something that they're very much aware of, and it touches their lives personally through family and friends. There is some history of government discrimination against Jews, particularly policies limiting and banning Jewish immigration, especially in the 1930s and 40s. And yet the fact that Australia has had two governors general who are Jewish shows a certain level of acceptance of Jews. And if you look today, so Jews are well integrated into Australian society, and yet anti-Semitism persists both in the mainstream and on the fringes. So the current situation for Jews in Australia is security is a major factor. So the Jewish community's places of worship, schools, communal organisations and community centres need, for security reasons, to operate under the protection of high fences, armed guards, CCTV cameras, metal detectors and the like. This necessity is recognised by Australia's law enforcement agencies and arises from the entrenched and protean nature of anti-Semitism in Western and Middle Eastern cultures, resulting in a high incidence of physical attacks against Jews and Jewish communal buildings over the last 3 decades in Australia, and continuing threats. In practice, it means every time a Jew goes to synagogue or a Jewish school or a Jewish facility, they go through security measures, guards and the like. It is a normal part of life for Jews in Australia. In the public sphere, Jews who are identifiably Jewish, for example, wearing a Jewish skull cap or a Star of David necklace, or carrying Jewish items, are at greater risk of harassment or worse. Many incidents occur around synagogues on Friday night and Saturday. As Jews walk to and from synagogues, it is common that people drive their cars around the area looking for Jews to verbally abuse or do a gun gesture, or throw items at them, for example, eggs or cans of drink. Sometimes people in a car will go to a couple of synagogues in order to abuse more Jews. Casual anti-Semitism is the one form of anti-Semitism that every Jew has faced, whether it is jokes, stupid comments, or stereotypes about Jews being rich or stingy or controlling the world. And these often comes from work colleagues, neighbours, in social settings and elsewhere. Casual anti-Semitism in general makes one feel very uncomfortable, but not necessarily physically threatened. Jews have faced anti-Semitism for over 2,000 years, so it is something that is part of normal life for Jews, but something that can suddenly explode and our lives are changed. So anti-Semitism differs from other forms of racism in one major way. It is based on false myths, entrenched stereotypes, and on conspiracy theories that the Jews are all powerful and absolutely evil, and who work together as one entity in order to destroy non-Jews and to dominate the world. The important lesson for all is to take a stand against racism and other forms of bigotry, to call it out, to condemn it, and to ensure that it's pushed back out of the mainstream society. It is especially important that, one, there are effective and appropriate laws, both civil and criminal, to protect against harassment, vilification, and incitement. Two, that educational programs are in place to educate people about the evils of racism and other forms of bigotry. And three, that political leaders and others such as academics, clergy, journalists, business people, trade unionists, human rights advocates and others publicly and forcefully denounce racism and other forms of bigotry in order to set the bounds of what is acceptable and unacceptable in Australian society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Julie. We were next hoping to have Daria Ina, who is responsible for the Islamophobia register in Australia, which was launched in 2014. It seems that Daria has not been able to join us. The technological difficulties can sometimes be bigger than the physical difficulties in joining a Zoom call. So I'm really sorry that we don't have Daria with us. But what I might just do very, very quickly, because I'm not going to be able to do justice to Daria's deep expertise on this, is pull out a few key points that we've identified in our joint paper. So we set some of this out from about page 9. But essentially, the Islamophobia register was established to try by the Muslim community itself. So there's some real parallels to the work that Julie was just talking about from the perspective of the Jewish community, but to try and document and get a handle of the size, scope, and nature of racism and bigotry experienced by Muslim people in Australia. The most recent report was released last year, and it documents 349 verified instances of reported Islamophobia from 2016 to 2017. The sorts of data that came out of there are interesting, I guess, but really I'm a human as well as a lawyer, and I've got to say deeply upsetting and troubling. So I just want to draw out a few key points that we at the Human Rights Commission found particularly troubling. 72% of the victims were women and 71% of the perpetrators were men. Only 29% of incidents were reported to police. So well less than half of those incidents were reported to police. And yet 1 in 20 of the incidents resulted in the victim requiring hospital treatment. Interestingly, of female victims in the physical world, as distinct from on the online area where people can be harassed, 96% of those women and girls were wearing a headscarf. So those statistics, I think, are deeply, deeply troubling. But what we always try to do and no doubt the same at the Victorian Commission as at the Australian Human Rights Commission, is we try to understand the experience of the individuals behind those statistics, and so we do give some examples of those. One which I found particularly resonant with me was the experience of a woman who was simply trying to catch a local train with her 6-year-old daughter. I have a child almost that age, and she was horribly verbally abused just because of being visibly Muslim. And what she said, and I'll quote from her directly, was incredibly poignant. She said, "How do I explain to a little child the harshest realities of religious and cultural discrimination that Muslims are facing throughout the world?" End quote. And it's that sort of experience that I think has been particularly important for my team at the Commission, and I know Kristen's team as well, in saying we need to get a better handle of what this problem is, and we need to come up with very practical proposals of better addressing that problem as well. So what I might do now is to hand over to Kristen to moderate some Q&A. As I'm doing the handover, you can start thinking of some questions that you might wish to ask. You can ask those questions via the chat function of Zoom. Back to you, Kristen.
Thanks very much, Ed, and thank you to you too, Julie, for your insights and research and your ongoing advocacy in this space. So I guess the upside is that we have more time for questions, and please do send them through on the chat function. And while I'm moderating, I'll have a look and make sure that we get to as many of them as possible. Let me put it out there to all of you at this point, though, and just to see if there are any particular points that anyone would like to raise or comment on. I know that Adele Salman is here from the Islamic Council in Victoria. So Adele, given that we haven't got Daria Ina here, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on or expand on anything that Ed has spoken about or anything else in the report.
Can you hear me?
All good, yes.
Oh, good. Hello. Thanks, Kristen, and thanks, Ed. And it's a shame that Daria couldn't join us, but she's obviously the expert in terms of the reporting of Islamophobic incidents over the last few years. So I can't possibly do it justice, but as you would know, Kristen, the ICV, Islamic Council of Victoria, which is the organisation that I'm representing today, we've also been doing a lot of work in this space. Whilst we're not capturing incidents to the same degree as the Islamophobia Register Australia, we are cooperating with them and sharing information. And anecdotally, we've seen a large increase in Islamophobic incidents, even since Christchurch, which is probably surprising for many people, because in the immediate aftermath of Christchurch, there was an incredible outpouring of solidarity and support from the non-Muslim community for Muslims that's here in New Zealand. That still continues, by the way. So all of the people of goodwill, they made their voices heard, but those who have ill will towards Muslims, they have been emboldened, and which is really shocking. They've been emboldened to become more public about their hatred. They feel that what happened in Christchurch is almost a rallying cry for all those who, I guess, subscribe to the same methodology, whether it be organisational level or individuals. They all subscribe to particular viewpoints about Islam and Muslims. And I noted that the comment by Julie in relation to anti-Semitism, in our view, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiment has a lot of similar traits with anti-Semitism. And it dates back many centuries. So it dates back to the first interaction between Islam and Europe. And some of the stereotypes have continued to today. And that is that, Islam is inherently evil. Islam is out to destroy Christianity, the West. Muslims are all part of one community. They all conspire with one another. They're looking to overturn the status quo. They're looking to impose Sharia. Muslims cannot be trusted, etc. So there are a lot of similar stereotyping of Muslims and Islam, and this is a global phenomenon, as applies to the Jewish community. And I also noted that Julie's comments and the reasoning why ECAJ does not track and report online hate. And I accept those reasons absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense. From our perspective, a lot of the worst forms of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobia, and incitement to violence against Muslims happens online. And a lot of the concerns that we've raised with authorities is because of what is said online. And it can be very, very alarming. And yes, I take the point, it'd be like counting raindrops. I mean, if you go online, the hatred towards Muslims, Islam, the number of pages, the number of posts, the number of people, number of organisations that are doing this each and every day, every hour of the day is overwhelming. You can't possibly track all. But what we do try to do is highlight some particular examples. We are trying to work with the authorities. We're trying to work with the likes of Facebook to mitigate the prevalence for online hatred. We've made various submissions. And the other point I'll make as well, Kristen and Ed, is in relation to the public narrative. when you have politicians who espouse some pretty hateful views about migrants, about asylum seekers, about Muslims, and I don't need to name them because I think we all know who they are. And that again emboldens those who have these views and have hatred in their hearts. Say, well, if my political representatives can say these things, then surely I'm allowed to do that as well. And so what's been happening, unfortunately, over the last several years is the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim hate in the public narrative. And that is something we are really struggling to deal with. Again, we've been pushing back, we've done what we can, but you know, I won't say it's a losing battle, but it's certainly a very, very difficult challenge for us to be able to tackle that as well. So there's just some few comments.
I might, sorry, Adele, I've just found out that Daria has been able to join us. So it's a bit of a calendar glitch. So if you don't mind, we might leave it there, but thank you. And what I might do is just to, Daria, just to note, we have gone through the main findings or the data from the Islamophobia register. Ed did that a few minutes ago. But I thought what I might ask you is, what trends have you seen over the last few years? And I mean, do you share the sentiment that Adele described, that things are either becoming worse or more normalised? And I guess the follow-up to that is, what are some of the effective interventions that governments can make? And then after that, we might just quickly outline what the recommendations in our report are and then open up for questions again. But lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry about the confusion. It seems like there was something wrong in my calendar because it shows 1:30 start. Luckily, I'm here. I was able to make it. Maybe I had a few pictures. Maybe they will be, I think, influential to show what is going on. Maybe just as an introduction to register also, I want to mention, I think, the leadership, women's leadership in the register and the reputation since 2014 with the, I think, reports in which actually made international, I think, impact because CSU Media Metrics found out that over 720 million people heard or saw the report, because that was many times on print media, TV news, and social media were mentioned. And we were interestingly invited to meetings with some embassies from Canberra. So it seems like it is becoming an international, I think, awareness. And I think you already addressed that Muslims are mostly targeted community in Australia. And I think my highlight here would be, hate really doesn't appear overnight, and it doesn't stay stable either. In our report, we try to look into the self-radicalization stages, and it starts furry, and it can go with contempt and dehumanizing also leading to disgust, and disgust brings violence. It is like when you see a cockroach in your house, you just want to get rid of it. But likewise, just starting as just simple hate can really lead into dehumanizing Muslims as unwanted, disgusting creatures, and the natural instinct would be remove them. So this doesn't happen overnight, and it has a gradual, I think, growth. And this growth, I think, is something to discuss, highlight, and also this type of feelings, when we were scaling these feelings, there is no meaningful distribution between online and offline. So you'll find more disgust in physical incidents or more dehumanization in physical incidents, which is a concern. It's not just simple hate speech. What we know is dehumanizing can lead to disgust, and disgust can lead to dehumanization. And also serious harms increase since the last report from 2 to 5%. And also wanting to kill consists 1/4 of the general online cases. Here, normalized Islamophobia is a problem because right-wing extremists are utilizing that common sentiments, normalize Islamophobia, to spread their ideology and also recruit new members. And the research in Victoria and also New South Wales, watching for far-right extremist groups, are also repeating that tendency. That was also highlighted in a conference here. And also Julie Nathan in her open letter was mentioning in her open op-ed, she was mentioning, she was quoting this very strikingly, a conversation between two United Patriots Front's forerunners. My personal opinion is to stick to Muslim such and such, and cultural Marxism for max support to do Jews later. You don't need to show your full hand. And this is leading us to the utilization of frustration moments, especially when ISIS terrorism, when ISIS attacks happen somewhere else in the world. The I think repercussions in our country was utilizing these moments to escalate hate. We were talking about dehumanizing. Now it turns into discuss and also removing, wanting to remove Muslims. And also that was a really legitimate atmosphere to also, let's say, express their already, I think, strong, severe hate. Look at these cases. This is a man holding two guns in hand, and he says a dead Muslim is a good Muslim. And each of them really were freely expressed on media, on social media. The thing is, they really use the right time to show, legitimize this level of serious harm. So kill or be killed, massacre all the Muslims. This problem cannot be fixed with lower political correctness. And another person is saying, they killed our children and I will jump the curb and run over you, your kids, your wife, and I will just, I will not show mercy. I will reverse my car back and run it over you again and again until you die. Look at the dates. These are from 16 years, 2016, 2017, 2017. But again, it didn't stop there. But also another, I think, idea would be, okay, this is an online case, nothing happens. But I think my point here is just a drop is enough to turn this online hatred into a massacre, like it happened in the Christchurch attack. And here is a quote from terrorist Brenton from his manifesto. He is explaining what was the last drop for him. And as you review his manifesto, it is so scary that the rhetoric is so usual, so familiar. But here he says also, I could no longer bring the sneer to my face. I could no longer turn my back on the violence. Something this time was different. That difference was Ebba Ekerland, young, innocent, dead Ebba. And she was killed in another attack in Stockholm in 2017. So again, going back to these people and this case, what is the difference? So I just feel, and like many Muslims, I just fear that they need a drop to be able to come to this level. And this is scary itself. And also in our third report, Islamophobia report, we will mention the details and give the examples. But another scary thing is violence increase after Christchurch attacks. So Islamophobia Register received 83 cases in the next 2 weeks of the Christchurch attack, and 1/4 of them were inciting severely violent discourse. Here are a few examples. Jim's mosque cleaning service. This was just right after the mosque attack. And this guy with his weapon, he's saying, I'm ready for the civil war when it starts in Australia. And these are online, and you know that people, like-minded people, are ready for something. And again, the examples were from 16, 17, and now these examples are from after Christchurch, remove kebabs, St. Tarrant, remove cars in another mosque wall, 2019, 2020. So how does the Muslim community feel? And I can bring examples from 2014 and 15 as well. It is same, it doesn't change, the severity is there. And now after Christchurch, which is a confirmed case that just one drop is enough for a crazy man to commit to this atrocity anywhere, anytime, and you feel defenseless. You don't know when it will come, and that kind of, I think, unrest itself is a concern for a mother sending her child to an Islamic school, for a family going for Eid prayer to a mosque. So for a woman, you never know when, anything can happen anywhere. So these are, I think, concerns that needs to be addressed. So one issue is not, sometimes we are not taking online crimes seriously. And another is reporting to police. Sometimes people feel unheard. And we also refine our reporting tool to capture how people are feeling about the impact. And also if they're not reporting to police, why? We try to also ask these questions in our report to be able to understand what is going on. And when it comes to recommendations, again, these are also in relation to some conferences and projects we conducted. I think repairing broken societies is important to avoid victim mentality. Because even terrorist, Tarrant is using a victim mentality, showing that we are defeated culturally, demographically, and also our children are killed. So throw them back. The vicious circle of mirror effect with this victim mentality. We need to repair broken societies. And I think the best way is to empower communities, even in data collection. I would say, let's go back to the communities because it is evidently working. It is very well working with Islamophobia register. So empower data collection that is working. And also, when we had a conference with the New South Wales government, it was a collaborative approach to solutions, and the repeated suggestion was a cross-community alliance. So then again, we are learning from more established communities how to tackle, how to deal, how to handle hate, and also avoid victim mentality. Another thing is, I think, that is also from Sydney University's Policy Lab report this year that was giving recommendations to New South Wales government. It says avoid government-led initiatives. Government should be facilitator. So I would say in relation to the suggestions they made, I would say maybe let's focus on let communities lead the initiative, embed their learning from going to the grassroots, and also invest into people, targets, and bystanders to stay strong. And I think as a result, if we can empower communities and if we can facilitate a cross-community alliance, that would bring us consistent data collection. Also embedding and learning from other established communities' experience, so that we can identify what is working for Muslims, what is not maybe, but also that alliance working with New South Wales Police, and also in collaboration with report collecting and service providing organizations and commission itself. If we work all together, we can have clear, consistent data which can be analyzed, and also I think which can make better impact. Sometimes bypassing communities is not really helpful, because you feel you're just a data collection resource, but that's it. You don't want it. You want more. And I think this initiative, even having this conversation, even letting me talk today and making my points, letting me make my points itself, is showing how much you value communities, how much you value research coming from communities. And thank you very much for that.
Thanks so much, Derry. I'm so pleased that you were able to join us. And I can assure you that a lot of your thinking and those recommendations have fed into ours. And there was a question that Natalie asked earlier just about outlining the recommendations in the report. There are 3 major ones, and they're designed to be practical and achievable. And they very much pick up on both what you and Julie have spoken about and through what we heard in the consultations. The first one is that we've made it only to the Commonwealth and Victorian governments because really they're the jurisdictions that Ed and I operate in, although I would encourage all state and territories to look at the report. But the recommendations that are applied to the Commonwealth and Vic governments is that they should commission ongoing quantitative research in accordance with proper standards that looks at the nature and the prevalence of serious harms of religion. And we go into a little bit more detail about what that recommendation looks like, but one of the key tenets of it is that it should involve very close and deep collaboration with religious leaders and representatives of the community, because we can see, and we have learnt talking to you and Julie, the importance of recording those stories and the importance of understanding the types of incidences that are occurring. I mean, it creates a very visceral reaction, and as awful as those stories are, we continue to need to tell them and to actually get a sense of how prevalent they are. The second recommendation is that the Commonwealth Government establish a multi-faith advisory group, which consists of leaders and representatives of different religious groups across Australia, that advises the government on the practical experience of freedom of belief and religion, as well as having a policy and law reform lens. There is a multi-faith advisory group that exists here in Victoria, and that is a model that the Commonwealth Government could look at. And thirdly, what we heard again and again in the consultations is the critical need for education and the diminishing value in public education about religious faith here in Australia. And so that is a critical recommendation of ours, that the Commonwealth and Victorian governments should each develop religious engagement and public education programs about religion and the place of it in Australia. Very much led by a human rights lens or framework, and that education program should be going to the children. It should be in schools. It should be part of police and security services. So they're the main 3 they're the main 3 recommendations. There's more detail in the report, and again, I really encourage you to share that with your networks. Just on the final recommendation, which is around the public education program, I might just throw to you, Ed, about what you think that level of appetite from the federal government is for commissioning that sort of education program, given that you've been having those discussions recently.
Well, I mean, it was something that came up, particularly the research side, and research and education came up in the Ruddock panel's report, and the federal government's response to that report was essentially positive. And so they did sort of lay out in very broad principle terms a way forward. And what we are trying to do with this position paper is say, okay, well, we've seen that commitment, we've seen the principle, let's take this the next step and actually make it a reality. So I think that there is an appetite. I guess everything at the moment that is not kind of directly related to COVID-19 comes with a bit of a caveat about that as to whether or not it will get prioritised when that's the lens that everything is being looked at the moment. Maybe while I've got the conch, I might also mention, so Deirdre Palmer asked a question, I think, about federal legislation, so the federal religious discrimination reform. So that, I think, is, the question was essentially, where's that up to? The Prime Minister said essentially that that's still part of government policy, but it's something that's had to take a back seat for now. That's our understanding. I think the Attorney General has made similar public comments as well. And so I guess we'll just wait to see.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, Ed. We are remarkably almost out of time already. So I wanted to just take the last 2 minutes to thank you all for joining the panel today, and to thank our panellists, and to thank you for the input during the consultations and other conversations that we've had along the way, and they will obviously continue. I know Adele and I are meeting with the Victorian Multicultural Minister tomorrow, so it's another good opportunity to raise some of these issues. I'd also really like to thank Ed and his fantastic team at the Australian Human Rights Commission, who have led much of this work. And I'd also like to thank my own team, particularly Emily Yates, Amy Rogers and Peter Davis and Moni Saram for making today happen. And to thank you all for attending. But Ed, I'll hand over to you for a final few last words.
Thank you. There were really two things I wanted to do. I wanted to thank my colleagues at the Australian Human Rights Commission as well, in particular Daniel Nellor, the Specialist Advisor on religious discrimination, religious freedom at the Commission, Lauren Perry, John Howe and Liz Stevens. Daniel and Lauren were the principal authors of the paper from our side, and were just did an absolutely sterling job, and you'll have met them also in the roundtables if you had a chance to attend one of those. The last thing I wanted to say is this. We talk a lot at the moment about resilience and adaptability in the context of COVID-19. We've seen at the Human Rights Commission time and again how religious communities have been remarkably resilient and adaptable. When we're talking about the world's so-called great religions that have been around for many, many, many hundreds of years, we often think of those bodies wrongly as being kind of impervious to change. Quite the contrary. I have been, my heart has been truly warmed to see so many different faith groups say, yes, religion is something that we do in community. For a period, throughout Australia, people simply weren't able to attend places of worship in any way, shape or form, but people adapted to that. There were remarkable ways in which people used technology to come together, to help people who were particularly vulnerable, older people, people who don't have the social security safety net and others. That isn't just heartwarming, it shows to me the true value that religion can have and faith communities can have in our community and enriching our community, but also in making our Australia a more humane place for everyone. So I thank all of you for the work that you do in that regard. Once again, I thank Kristen and her team at the Victorian Commission and my own colleagues for walking with me on this project. Back to you, Kristen.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ed. Be safe, take care of yourselves and your people, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.